What gave you the inspiration to write a book on aesthetics and grief and loss?
Loss, of course. But quite a number of years ago, a philosophy professor who was also an art critic came to UT and gave a talk in which he was talking about some paintings that were very beautiful, but called elegies. And he was talking about how beauty seems somehow to, I don't know, be it creates a kind of significance, and seems apt for something as basic as deep grief or a sense of mourning. And I'm sure that's one of the things that primed me to think about this. But when my late husband died, I was noticing how many people were relating to me in somewhat aesthetic ways. I mean, people would send flowers or do make these gestures, and they would seem gestural, or the idea of doing something that is sort of presentational and having rituals. And it just struck me that really we almost have no way of functioning without aspects of our way of relating to the world that would be obviously aesthetic in any other context. And the more I started looking at things that had an aesthetic aspect that were connected with grief and mourning, the bigger the list became. Um, my dissertation advisor has written about the ethical significance of architecture, and one of his sentences in the book is, in paraphrase, that if you look back far enough in history, the history of architecture is essentially a history of tombs,
Hmm.
because, like really massive building structures
Right.
were designed to commemorate as much as they were to do anything else. And even when other functions took over, the commemorative aspect often remained a part of it. So he would point out that in many European churches where significant figures are buried, that's as much a part of the function of the church in some ways as just to house the living, because it makes them connected with other people who have passed on.
Hmm.
And so I just started thinking about that, and then all the many ways in which the the arts, narrowly considered, but also um, aesthetics more broadly considered, touches on many of the ways that people who are grieving start to rebuild their lives. And so, yeah, that's kind of how that came to be. And then the kind of thing we were talking about in connection with songs, I've I found a lot of solace in some stories or films in which people had dealt with things maybe not exactly like I was dealing with, or maybe even obliquely a little bit connected with it, but nevertheless, they served as sort of guideposts. And so it just struck me that this was something worth drawing to people's attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things there that it's difficult, right, is that for something like grief, especially when it's like a husband or a, or a wife or someone that you love, a partner. And I'm so
Mhm.
sorry to hear that, by the way. When you go through something like that, you feel that no one can ever possibly understand what that's like, even though you might read of someone who was in a very similar situation, because that's sort of true. Like it is your subjective
Yeah.
experience, and no one will ever know. But is it good to know? Is it beneficial? Is it valuable that there are people who have experienced grief like what you're going through at the least to give you those guideposts in a way?
Well, I think it would be good if grief were kind of more socially um, out in the open.
Right.
And I guess one of the reasons that artworks are so useful is that in in our societies, it isn't something that people make very obvious. And there is, like the wonders of medical science make it seem like something has gone wrong
Right.
if somebody dies. And the fact that it is not something as in the past that people are experiencing on a routine basis in their own families. But even when it happens in the family, most people go elsewhere to die. Just makes people feel, I mean, I think it makes people very nervous. I mean, of course, people are nervous about dying, but um, they don't really know how to think about or feel about
Yeah.
grief. And certainly it's not something that is a socially welcome topic of conversation.
Right. Right.
So without artworks, I think we'd be kind of stuck for signposts, except in, really private conversations that many people might not have occasion to have.
Do you think that's because art gives people a sort of abstract representation of death and dying, which helps them because that means they don't have to touch it, face to face, so to speak, like,
Yeah.
but it's close enough for them to get a feel.
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity to explore emotional experience that yeah, it doesn't have to be what you're going through. I mean, like when people well-meaningly try to tell you what you're feeling, it's
Yes.
often done very well.
Yeah.
And in the case of somebody writing a novel or making a movie, no one is saying this is what you're feeling.
Right.
They're just putting out there that, you know, someone has felt this way.
Yeah.
And that that can that can be more of a bridge than trying to pinpoint what it is that a individual is feeling at any given point.
And I also think that what's so wonderful about art, if it's done well, especially in the context of grief and loss, is that if it's done well, then it's deeply vulnerable and deeply honest, and and
Mhm.
and it almost says, hey, look, nothing's off the table. Like I remember reading, I'm not sure if you've read A Matter of Death and Life by Irvin Yalom.
Oh, I haven't read it. No,
Oh, it's
but I obviously should because I love his work.
Yes, yeah, he's a real idol of mine, and that book was written by him and Marilyn as his wife, late wife now, was battling with cancer, and he
Mm.
finished the second half of the book with just him alone and his experiences with grief. It's a Sorry for everyone listening. It's a pretty small book, so it's very digestible, but just a beautiful book, and one of the things I loved about it was that in his experience after she'd passed, and I think they'd been together since he was 14 or something
Oh,
insane. So
wow.
kind of, just to know someone your whole life,
Hmm.
he was so honest, which is why we love him so much, right? Um, and he's talking about how he just can't suppress this newfound sexuality when he's
Mm.
and which is actually quite common, but he goes into details about
Mhm.
like you can't stop looking at women's breasts and all this sort of thing, and it's what I loved reading about that was that, like I said before, grief is so stigmatized because no one talks about it because it's painful to talk about. But when got
Mhm.
someone so honest to talk about it, you see that everything's on the table. You can have these
Yeah, yeah,
thoughts and what it's fine.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that well, a a colleague that also writes about grief that I've talked with a lot, says that people really think they're going crazy. And that's another reason why people don't talk much about it, because the people that are having the experience, even my own father was saying that he'd hesitated to tell me something. And I said, well, why? And he said, because I thought you'd think I was crazy.
Yep.
Well, that just comes with the territory, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. You're absolutely right. I think, yeah, trying to normalize all different sorts of funny thoughts that come up and different sort of proclivities and intuitions and things is so important. The concept of art as well, I think, is really good too, because and I'm sure you've probably experienced this and probably part of the reason why you wrote the book, but it gives you a sense of control and agency when
Oh,
you've
yeah.
feelings that are hard to manage.
Yeah. I mean, when my late husband died, I just started writing him letters because it seemed like that's a good form for communicating at a distance.
Right.
Like when you're writing a letter, people aren't, they are reading it.
Right.
um, and for me, that really helped a lot because it had kind of a customary form to it. Um, but it still was moving it out in his direction, kind of streaming out.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the mind has to recalibrate, it's very hard for the mind to sort of understand that someone can just not be here in time and space.
Yeah.
It's such
Yeah.
an tool. It's very strange.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that's why people go around, kind of expecting to see a person that they know they're not expecting to see, but nevertheless.